First, I just want to thank everyone for being here, our attendees and our panelists. We're very excited for this conversation. I'm just going to get a little housekeeping out of the way before we get started. There is a question and answer function. Please submit your questions just as we go. We're really hoping to keep this pretty informal and conversational. We've all been in more than enough Zoom meetings and webinars, so hoping this can be a little more engaging. So submit your questions as they come up, and I'll try to fit them into our conversations as we go, though we will save a few minutes at the end for audience Q&A. Because, you know, for the lawyers in the crowd, this is a webinar, this is a discussion for informational purposes only. Nothing we talk about today should be considered as investment or any other type of advice, and any mention of a company by name should not be considered a recommendation for that company or solicitation to buy or sell any securities. So now that we have that out of the way, I'm very excited. We're definitely going to be talking about some companies and the vaccine rollout around the world today. The first thing we're going to try to cover is just the state of play, get a handle on where we're at, what vaccines exist, who's producing them, and what the access is. I'll stop sharing that for now so you can see our panelists. Then we're going to discuss some of the challenges created by that approach, some of its shortcomings, both practically from a health perspective, from an investment perspective, and from an ethical perspective. And then finally, what we should be doing. What do we really expect the companies to do differently? How do we want them to address the situation? And how do we evaluate the commitments they've already made? And we're very lucky to have some experts on the line with us today who can help us understand each of those things. So before we go any further, maybe we'll just do a quick round of introductions. My name is Corey Clever. I'm the Director of Engagement for Domini Impact Investment. Very pleased to be hosting this panel. And Anna, perhaps we'll start with you. Just a few quick words about your organization, and actually it'd be great if everyone could just say a word about how they came to this work, what path led them here.
Absolutely. So thank you, Corey, for this invitation. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel. My name is Ana Cespedes. I'm Chief Operating Officer at Ayavi. Ayavi is a global organization headquartered here in New York, and we are dedicated to developing vaccines and antibodies for infectious diseases that are affordable and accessible. And I came to this work because, I mean, innovation is not such if it doesn't reach the people who really need it. And after many years in pharma, I found really exciting to be able to be part of those, you know, people who contribute to making medicines accessible.
And Moga? Perhaps you next.
So, Moga Kamaliani, I'm currently a freelance consultant. I'm a consultant to UNAIDS, the UN agency on HIV, and senior policy and technical advisor to the People Vaccine Alliance, which is an alliance of so many organizations, academics, all sorts of people who are committed to having to making COVID vaccines accessible to everybody and free at the point of use. How did I came to this? That is a long story. All my life I've been working on access to healthcare, including access to medicine, since the day my parents insisted that I go and do medicine, and I didn't want to. But they said to me that they lost 2 kids to childhood diseases, and they said, we want you as the first to go and be a doctor so that you can spare parents the agony of losing their kids. So since then I've been working on that, and I loved it.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both for your work. And Nolan from Domini, round us out.
Hi, my name is Nolan Ritzy. I'm VP Impact Research at Domini Impact Investments. I also lead our pharma research at pharma and healthcare at Domini. And yeah, I mean, I don't have as great a story. I basically did work in moral and ethical philosophy, and then moving on to my PhD, moved more into bioethics work, which kind of brought me into a nonprofit working on clinical trial transparency, which the time seems to be a really niche interest, but now, of course, we're all very interested in seeing the underlying data and the clinical trials that are ongoing and have been completed for these vaccines. So Preston, maybe, and then I came over to Domini to get more on the hard side of pharma and investing and make my mark in the pharma world that way, out of the nonprofit space and into the for good profit space, I suppose.
Yeah, so I mean, I think everyone here probably, we've had a lot of the same questions. We're more than a year into the pandemic. It's incredible how fast these vaccines have rolled out, but there are still a lot of questions about who's going to get vaccinated and when. We were just talking before we started about New York. Everyone over 30 just became eligible in New York. It's been a little different around the world, and certainly there's less developed countries that are, have virtually no vaccinations being rolled out at this point. So I think that raises questions both in terms of, what's the right thing to do, but also what's the fastest way out of this pandemic, and how do we assess, how do we get there? I think everyone can kind of share that goal, but then there's really hard questions about how do we get from A to B, and what role do the companies play? What role does government play? What role do we play as investors and as a broader global community? How do we get around this? Because I think this is global pandemic really makes clear the importance of collective action and how we're all connected through our decisions and public health. So with that, maybe we just get started. I am not a scientist. Last biology class was high school, and so I understand that there are vaccines for things, and that's about as far as I get. So it's just helpful to understand there's different types of vaccines. I understand that now. And we have developed a few different types to address COVID, and they each have their own kind of implications for the technology you need to develop them, how do you produce them, how do you deliver them, and then questions around pricing. But so Anna, I'm going to look to you and see if you can walk us through just some high level basics to understand both what are the vaccines, who's making them, what's available, and what are some of the challenges. And I've got a few of your slides. Is now a good time to pull those up?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and thank you for that. A vaccine is, to me, as a pharmacist, I have a PhD in pharmacy, even though I work in the business space of the science as chief operating officer. I think vaccines are one of the greatest innovations, because basically that is as simple as replicating something as similar as possible to the virus without provoking the disease, right? So the different platforms are basically different ways of doing so. You can inactivate the virus, that's a platform. You can attenuate the virus, which is another platform. You can take a piece of the virus, like a subunit, and this is Novavax vaccine, for example. Or you can use another virus, which is not pathogenic in humans, to insert a piece of the genetic material of the virus versus which you want to produce immunogenicity. That's the viral vector vaccines, that's AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Janssen. Or, and this is new, you can take directly a piece of genetic material of the virus. Now, genetic material is not very stable, and we weren't able to do this before, right? And we haven't been able, because after 3 decades of research, we finally were able to deliver the genetic material directly. Just to be very clear, we've always been using genetic material to produce immunogenicity, but we were inserting it into a vector. So the difference is that now we can do it directly. So that's kind of the different technologies. And if we move on to the next slide, it's pretty impressive. I mean, for somebody, I've been working in pharma 20 years and now in global health, I've never seen, if we go, Corey, to the next slide, such a level of development. We have more than 300 programs, and the numbers change depending on what database you use across the world. Almost 187 are already in clinical trials, and around 26 in later stage. We moved from the lab to phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So by now we already know that. And there are 10 vaccines which are being used outside of the clinic. So let me say this because I think it has a lot of implications to the discussion. 4 vaccines, the ones that you see there in the green box, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Janssen, have been approved by regulatory bodies in Western countries, FDA, EMA, or even the WHO. Other vaccines, this is famous Sputnik, Bharat, BioNTech, Vector, Sinovac, these Chinese vaccines, they are already being used outside of clinical trials in different groups of populations. However, they are not yet approved by regulatory bodies such as FDA, EMA, or WHO. And the reason for that is because they didn't present the data in the way that is requested by these bodies. It doesn't mean that the data couldn't be high efficacy, high safety. We don't know. We need to see, right? So that's why they aren't approved. Every product is approved under the so-called emergency use authorization. It's called in the US and in the United Kingdom. In Europe, it's called conditional approval. And what it means is that information is enough to have the vaccine being used outside of clinical trials. That's a big decision for a regulatory body, but still there's some data that we would like to have. And once we have this data, for example, duration of protection, certain subpopulations, etc., this will be the so-called final approval. You'll hear about that, okay? So if we move on to the next one, Corey, and I'm going very fast because this is just like a snapshot, okay? And we can go deep into more details later. These were the leading vaccines approved, right? And once, just a few like tips on how to read data because it's pretty overwhelming. And the problem is that because we've been following these vaccines since they were in the lab, we basically got exposed to data that normally general population don't get exposed, like X% of efficacy in animal models, X% in preliminary data, X% in final. So suddenly you have like so much data available that it becomes a little bit confusing. So important here, efficacy. But efficacy is defined in the case of the vaccines that have been approved, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson, in terms of percentage of prevention versus symptomatic disease. Meaning a 95% efficacy of Pfizer means 95% of people out of 100 are protected from symptomatic disease. It doesn't mean you are protected from asymptomatic infection. That we don't know. So efficacy is important, similar efficacy, Pfizer and Moderna. It's also very important, the age groups, depending on how the studies have been done. Some vaccines, we'll see the case of AstraZeneca, have been selected to be used only in less or younger populations, less than 65 years old. And this was because the trials, you see, thank you, Corey, the data on AstraZeneca, the trial was not so enriched for older populations. And some countries have decided different things. Children and infants have been included from vaccines studies. That is, studies are running. We'll learn about those in 2 months or so. And then always pregnant women are excluded, but people get pregnant, right? So we have a lot of data demonstrating safety in pregnant women, while studies formally still need to be finalized. The other very important thing, viral mutations, headline, bottom line here, there is an impact in efficacy. However, there is still efficacy versus the mutations, but it's very likely that we are going to have to either update the vaccines or maybe even implement a third dose. And finally, on the right, I included here, and I'm sure Corey will share the slides later, the number of doses. So here's the thing. If you take the flu campaign every year might be 500,000 doses, 500 million doses. Here we are talking about the needs of 15,000 doses for the global population. So the demand is very high. And some vaccines such as AstraZeneca probably were a little bit optimistic, I would say, in saying that they would be able to deliver 3,000 million doses. Pfizer was a little more prudent 1.2 billion doses. Johnson & Johnson is being very conservative in terms of number of doses, and we are seeing that companies are partnering. You also see some information on pricing, and just a heads up here on pricing is very difficult. And I mean, 7 years of my life, I was global head of market access and pricing for a pharmaceutical company. So when one thinks on pricing, normally pharmaceutical companies have invested fully the cost of the development. Here is a very different case because all these programs got either grants to finance the research and development processes, or what is called anticipated purchasing agreements that bought doses of vaccines, and these enable the larger scale manufacturing. So when one say, you know, AstraZeneca cost per dose maybe between $3 to $4, well, there's a lot of public funding there. So it's very difficult to compare here because every organization had different levels of funding from different governments or multilateral organizations. So Corey, I think that's okay for now. And then we...
Yes, that's a lot. I want to recap though, and I'm going to ask to clarify a few key points as I understand it. So the viral vector vaccines are grown in a lab. So it's, you use the genetic material, but you grow it in something, and then that's what you use as the vaccine. That is a long-standing technology. There's a lot of maybe capacity to do that. The mRNA is where you're actually directly synthesizing something. You're kind of like printing genetic material as opposed to growing it. So maybe it's faster, but it's brand new and very few have the capacity to actually do this. And that is the far more effective vaccine. And then one thing that I don't think we talked about here, but it's the mRNA ones are the ones that require the very cold storage. Is that right?
Yes, but it's changing because it is a new technology and the genetic material is inserted in a liposome, which is like a lipidic kind of molecule. So we are learning about stability. So what you do in manufacturing, you always start very conservative, -80. And then you say, well, maybe -20. So Pfizer got an approval recently that they can now conserve the vaccine at -20 for a few months, which is changing significantly because the difference is -80 is lab conditions. You don't have those extensively in low middle income countries or other geographies. So we are still to see, honestly, Corey, where the conservation, but it's definitely more complicated. And the difference you described very well, an RNA is a chemical compound you synthesize in the lab, while anything else, protein subunits, viral vectors, or inactivated, they are live, they are biological materials. They require to be grown. And you know, as with human beings, sometimes you grow faster, sometimes you go not that fast.
Yeah. And Moga and Nolan, jump in anywhere here. Yeah, Moga, take yourself off mute. Come in anytime.
Just a couple of things to add. What we hear from the mRNA, just remember that maybe 6 or maybe 8 months ago, not one single company was able to produce mRNA. So because it's new, nobody, even Moderna and Pfizer and BioNTech and all these, they couldn't produce it. It was new. So now there is, but however, having said that, there are many scientists in many countries that are studying mRNA. In fact, there is a Chinese company that's developing an mRNA vaccine. So although it's new, it doesn't mean it's so complex that it can't be produced. And the fact that it's chemical more than biological, if you like, means that it can be produced. And some of the original companies that produced mRNA, like CureVac, the German company, they said months ago that it's actually, once you got the template, it's easy to produce. So I don't think it's, that sometimes the way vaccines are presented is like, whoa, we can't do it in developing countries. Actually, we can. The other thing, even on Pfizer with -70 degrees for storage, don't forget that, say in Africa, you know, WHO and others and governments are delivering Ebola vaccine to rural areas in DRC in Congo, which requires that kind of, and the majority of infection in Africa is in big cities where they have hospitals that can actually store the virus, the vaccine. at that kind of temperature. So it's not impossible. It just makes it a bit difficult, but not impossible.
Yeah, that's very encouraging, actually. Just a quick question, the Sputnik vector, the biotech Sinovac, do you know if these are mRNA, or any of these mRNA, or there's just the one that China's working on that's an mRNA? Interesting.
No,
Sputnik is a viral vector. Yeah, Moga, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, Sputnik is a viral vector, and same is Bharat. I believe it's a viral vector. Indeed, Sputnik is two different viral vectors. The first dose is one, and the second dose is another one. It's an interesting development. Bharat, I'm not 100% sure if it is a viral vector or a subunit, but it's not RNA that I know.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of production, just a few more kind of level setting questions before we get into challenges. But where is the production capacity for these? You know, you're saying it's just in the 6 months this has come online. Who can produce this? What does it take? Is it like an input question? Like you need the lipid to store it in? Is that where the bottleneck is? Or is it like the actual machines that can print this? There's only 3 in the world. You know, where is the production capacity, and what's the total volume, like output capacity for each of these different types of vaccines?
So, I mean, I can get us started, and Mog, I'm sure you have more insights on this, and thank you. It's when a regulator approves a product, it's based on efficacy, safety, and quality. And what this means is that where it's produced, it has to require certain standards that are defined by each one of the regulatory bodies, whether it's WHO, EMA, or FDA, even though there are agreements and sometimes they rely on each other. So there is a component of having, one, the physical building with the machines with availability, because obviously there's a lot of biological production in the world, but it's busy doing other things, right? So you have to have this slot. Second, it's not only about the physical spot, you need to have the expertise. And that's what is called in pharma process development, which is like, imagine you're doing a recipe, right? You define how it's done in a small scale, like 200 liters. That's the process development. And then it's to learn to do at large scale. So there are like 3 elements of this, right? Developing the process, growing up the process. And what I'm saying to finalize here, and I think this is really encouraging, and this really speaks nicely about companies, is that think on pharmaceutical companies that are very strong on vaccines, such as Novartis or Sanofi. They didn't necessarily have the candidates succeeding in their trials. However, they are offering their manufacturing capabilities. The other one is Merck here in the US, to those companies who are ahead for production. And that's very relevant because this is the way forward.
Mm-hmm. Moga, is it going to be enough capacity-wise?
Well, the thing is, there is capacity to produce vaccines. The majority of vaccines, normal vaccines, you know, kids' vaccines, are produced actually in developing countries, particularly in India. So there is capacity. And like, for example, I've seen a plant in Bangladesh that was really, really impressive of what capacity they have. They produce, but they lacking the technology transfer and of course the intellectual property, so they can't produce. So there is capacity in a number of countries. Not every country has capacity, clearly, but a number of countries have companies that can produce. And the evidence for that is when AstraZeneca goes around and says, we have X bilateral agreement. Well, with who? With companies in developing countries. The same was Johnson & Johnson. Now they're talking about some agreements. So there is, even Pfizer, although they're denying that they're having some negotiation with India. But it's not just India. You know, Brazil has capacity, Indonesia, obviously China, Thailand, you know, even Vietnam, Singapore, there are capacity in a number of countries, but because there's lack of access to technology, these people are not coming forward. And Merck is a good example, actually. The Merck doing manufacturing Johnson & Johnson vaccines, they got $150 million from the US government. So who is giving any million or any dollar to any company in developing countries to produce the vaccines? Nobody is. So you're stopping the technology. So you know, so we don't. So you could say we don't have a total volume that they go. But the estimation that's happening now is that it says that what we have now is almost a third of the total capacity that is existing in the world. It's an estimate.
So we're only using a third of existing capacity. Wow. Before we move on to what companies should be doing, because we're starting to get into this technology transfer question, it clearly is really important. I just want to nail down some of the, make sure we're all kind of agreeing on what the challenge is here, or the importance of this. And I mean, I think there's an ethical component, but there's also a public health component, right? Like where we can't, vaccinating one country. Let me ask you, what is the problem if we just vaccinate Europe and the US? Does that let Europe and the US return to normal and open their economies again? Where does this fall apart?
It doesn't.
No, well, yeah, of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't, because, these things travel around the world. But, my interest in this, even assuming that it did, suppose that we had the best mRNA platform and that we could adjust the variants, it would still be wrong. And the reason it will be wrong is that we're prioritizing people that are not at a high risk. So if you imagine how we come up with our prioritization schedule in the United States, we took people who were at the highest risk of really bad outcomes or at the highest risk of getting infected, and we prioritized them first. What did we do with the rest of the world? We just let them wait, right? There are plenty of people around the world that are at high risk and are most likely going to be the ones that first get the disease. And why wouldn't we transfer some of our supply there? It makes good public health sense to, try to regulate things in a way that protects us, vaccinate the whole world so that we're protected. But there's also a question of rights here. And, what got me really interested in thinking about this was the kind of slant of vaccine nationalism that we've seen from many countries as things were rolling out. You might think of some early comments made by French regulators when Sanofi was doing a deal with the US, or you might think of Joe Biden. In each one of his speeches, he says, we're working to get every American citizen vaccinated. Well, I'm an American resident. I'm not an American citizen. We have plenty of undocumented people that are working hard, enabling us to do Zoom meetings by, picking vegetables and preparing, the fertile ground of online ordering, and those people aren't citizens. So, the kind of the national fealty trend here is really concerning to me. And so I guess I think a little. Public health tends to go, well, what can produce, the best outcome? And so I take a little detour there into talking about the rights of people. But I suppose even if we had the lockdown on a mRNA program, this wouldn't be the right way to go about it, because we're leaving the rest of the world to wait maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years until there's widespread access. So I think that's it's a moral failing. And is it a moral failing on all of us? Well, maybe to a certain extent that we're part of a collective action problem, but it's certainly a moral failing at the level of regulators and public health experts that can do something about it.
Can I add two imperatives?
Yes,
so you talk about the moral imperative. Let me talk about the economic imperative. So the International Chamber of Commerce came with this figure that the global economy will lose $9 trillion if people in developing countries are not vaccinated soon. The share of the US in this is 1.4 trillion, which is 6.5% of GDP. That's what we will lose in the US or globally if there is no vaccination in developing countries. And it is worrying there because Kenya, for example, they're having to vaccinate people. They decided, everybody complained about it, but I think they just show the reality of their vaccines, they decided that they're going to vaccinate maximum 30% of their population by mid-2023. 30%. That's nothing near, this is less than half what's required, or what epidemiologists say required for herd immunity, and by 2023. So with the economic imperative come the public health imperative, which has also economic side of it, which is these people, if they're not vaccinated by mid-23, and not all of them are vaccinated, that just leaves fantastic time for the virus to have, to modify, to change, to mutate, to do everything it wants, and come back to us, whether in the US or the UK or Europe, if it vaccinates people, come back with variants that are resistant to the vaccine. So all the money and the time and everything spent is going to be lost. And also, even if we have, somebody was saying to me yesterday, but we can tweak the vaccine. Yeah, sure, we don't have to start from zero, but even tweaking the vaccines, that means another dose or another vaccines to be given. How much is the cost of all that? When you're going to develop it? When you're going to roll it out at vast, at the scale that's needed? That's all. All this has an economic problem, economic implications for countries, for rich countries as well as poor countries. So it just doesn't make any sense from public health, economic, and moral imperatives to not care and not make a global plan of how do we reach herd immunity in every nation, so that we can all get out of this problem.
Yeah, I agree.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to add and build on what Moga and Nolan said, infectious diseases are global problems. So they require global solutions. So one might think this is about COVID-19. It's not. It's about MERS, SARS, Ebola, Zika, avian flu. We've been having an outbreak every 3 years over the last 20 years because we are basically invading the animal space. So, and we continue to manage this with a nationalistic approach. And we just need to pause here as not only, as Moga was very well saying, it's not only an ethical issue, it's even a financial issue. It's very ineffective to manage infectious diseases on a national basis. I know we like to think on our countries and the voters in our countries, that's very, normal, but we need to be smarter here because this might not be the last one.
Yeah, certainly. So, and let's just review quickly the variants. There's, it seems like the mRNA vaccines are fairly effective against the variants, but then the AstraZeneca one and the Johnson & Johnson one are less so.
That is not, if I try, I mean, maybe Moga want to share something else, but or Nolan, I didn't try to say that. So what happens is that RNA vaccines were developed at the moment where variants were not prevalent, right? So the clinical trials were done in a space where there was no variants. Now, how do we know whether they remain effective or not with the variants? Well, we know because we take antibodies and we also do other tests in the lab, right? So in the lab, what we have seen is that antibodies neutralizing the variants of South Africa. The problem is not that much the UK one, but that one, and we shouldn't be naming the location because it's not the right way, but I'm going to simplify and name the locations, are 1/6 in Moderna, meaning its antibodies are reduced 6-fold. There's also data demonstrating this week that antibodies, neutralizing antibodies against South Africa and potentially Brazil, variants are significantly reduced as well for Pfizer. Now, AstraZeneca, Johnson, and Novavax developed the vaccines a little bit later and did studies very much in South Africa where they were very prevalent. So in those cases, we have a lot of data, clinical data, not anymore lab data, demonstrating that efficacy decreases. Like, for example, Johnson & Johnson efficacy in the US is 72%. When it goes to South Africa, it's very close to 50. In Latin America, it's 62, right? So it's impacted, it decreases, but still there's efficacy. Now, this is the good news. The protection versus disease decreases, but apparently the protection versus severe disease and hospitalization is a little bit higher, right? So that's good news.
Yeah, that's great news. That's very encouraging. And then just another point of reference, most vaccines are how effective? Like regular vaccines for other things are considered, what's the efficacy rate of a normal vaccine, non-COVID, roughly, ballpark, anyone?
I mean, the expectation, Moga, you wanna go?
Oh, you're muted, Moga. I heard recently that they're lower than these numbers, and so relative to the
70% was an expectation, approximately. Yeah, but flu vaccine is around 30 to 60% because it depends on the variants that are dominant, right?
I think the highest efficacy is measles vaccine, which is over 90.
Okay, so let's talk about companies now, and what companies can and should be doing, because they've made all kinds of commitments about nonprofit pricing and about that they will share technology. And there's a lot of questions about how it's gotten financed with government support and what kind of obligation does that create to share the patents, share the technology, share the recipe. So maybe let's just start with what an access strategy needs to include, because the price is a part of it, right? But then you have to have enough doses so that you can, offer it to a wide range of people. And then it has to be able to get there. I feel like those are the three things we've talked about, right? Is the logistics of delivery, the manufacturing capacity, and then the pricing, the affordability question. So maybe let's start with price, because I know that's a hot topic right now. How do we understand the pricing? How do we unpack $4 per dose? Like how do we understand the research, the R&D support that came out of government, both either a direct grant or a pre-purchase agreement, or just other kind of support for R&D that enabled the vaccines that different companies developed?
Can I just say about the cost, what government kind of contributed and whatever, because it seems like we kind of, or some people anyway, imagine that the development of the vaccine happened from last April, let's say, or last March or last May or something. That is just not true. And I think, Anna, you kind of alluded to that this is the result of years of studies. So mRNA was studied by two University of Pennsylvania scholars who studied for 20 years. The Oxford AstraZeneca, they started working, Oxford University started working on a vaccine for SARS. And in fact, they developed a vaccine for SARS and kind of put it aside because SARS was merciful than on human beings than this one. And then when in January, Sarah Gilbert said that once they heard there is a disease, an unknown infection in China, they got out there and they started working on it. Once China put the genetic code online for this virus, then all the research started again. So you've got, again, 20 years in Oxford working on it. And before that, understanding virus, understanding how to put a genetic material on like another virus, like the AstraZeneca Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or to take a bit of this. These are years. Who paid for all that? It's us taxpayers. So it's public funding for research that took years of funding. And unfortunately, actually, we've been trying to get some data on that. Unfortunately, universities don't have a record of, we got that much money over the years for that study that led eventually to that vaccine or that drug even. And even the governments don't have kind of like good records of how much they spend on biomedical research, at least here. I don't know about the US. So I think in the US you're better than us here. So there is that before. Then last year is a different story. As you said, Anna, last year it was a very special. Even at the time of HIV, we didn't have, there was quite a lot of money put on research. It wasn't to that degree. And the governments paid for university to continue research, companies to continue development, the advanced purchase that you mentioned, Corey. And also, don't forget, with R&D, you get tax exemption, and you get other things, other benefits from government. So there's lots of government, or let's say public input, public funding in these vaccines, quite a lot, which makes it, makes us that we have to think about how to make it accessible. Plus, to be honest, even if there's zero funding, this is a pandemic that will affect everybody. So we need a new thinking.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Anna or Nolan, would you add anything just to that pricing, the R&D? There's like the tax benefit, the grant, the purchase agreement.
Yeah, this is. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I have a probably slightly more deflationary view of this, because almost all of the technology we use is somehow traced back to heavy government investment, including all of the machines we're talking on right now. So I think, in terms of the pricing, I would approach it again from a need perspective and think in terms of, what are the needs of a global pandemic? Well, the need is to make as much vaccine and treatment accessible as we possibly can do. Who gets paid? Well, we can figure out the money's at risk, and we can remunerate appropriately, and we can license and cross-license appropriately. I mean, it's worth noting that there are license agreements right now that exist between Pfizer, BioNTech, specifically in the U.S. government. We could ratchet those up or down, depending on what we really need. But we really also need, compulsory licensing, or suspension of patent licensing during the pandemic to get the thing going. So it doesn't much matter how much something costs if there's not enough supply, to go around, right? It's going to be a scarce good. So I guess I'm a little more deflationary about the investments, and more inflationary about the demands that people can make when you're in the grip of a public health crisis.
So that sounds like the role of government, though, then, to mandate licensing and to suspend IP. There's no company that would do that itself, or is that something a company could do directly?
Well, I don't think the company could do it. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Okay.
No, please finish.
The WTO has been petitioned to suspend some of the intellectual property protections on this, but there's now emerging some calls for compulsory licensing. I saw a company in Canada this week was looking for a compulsory license to make, I believe it's Johnson & Johnson. And, if the companies are not going to, transfer the IP, that might be the way forward. But certainly they could voluntarily license their technology and get started. I mean, if it's true that we have only a few companies in the world that can combine mRNA into lipid nanoparticles, let's get started. Let's get the lipid nanoparticle development around the world going right now. There's about the cost.
Well, so I want to come back to the technology transfer question, because obviously that's really key. But just to stick with price for a second, because I think, Anna, you had some things to add, and I know that this is something that has been a big issue with companies this proxy season as well, where we've seen a number of items come up on the ballot about how are they pricing and how are they considering government financing when they're making their pricing decisions. So Anna, why don't you go ahead and
yeah, I mean, I haven't seen any study published, and I'm really looking forward, because I'm sure there's gonna be, after a while, some studies. It's right now, without some kind of, I would say, curated data, almost impossible to understand public funding. I mean, these vaccines wouldn't have happened without the millions of dollars of public funding as fast, but without the private investment either. Like, this is, to me, the paradigm of public-private collaboration. Both parties have put a lot, and there's been a lot of in-kind collaboration. Like, for example, Moderna used NIAID network to do the trials. I mean, this is one of the major drivers of cost of a trial, the clinical development program. So I think I would envision that this being a paradigm of public-private partnerships that we've been talking for so long, it could be interesting that there is a research around, concrete funding coming from governments and multilateral organizations, both in kind and real funding, and how this was used and how this is impacting pricing. When it comes to IP, Corey, just to say something, I'm not a supporter of, suddenly removing IP and making it free, because I don't think this is going to help, because there is a component that can't be passive, which is technology transfer. You have to share with somebody how this actually is done. So I think we need to find mechanisms, and I think public-private partnerships are good ones to really incentivize other countries producing when there is manufacturing capacity available. And in Africa, there is a little bit of a challenge, but there are some places. In Latin America, you have Brazil, but there are other places where manufacturing capacity is small. But I think the key here is try to have some sort of public-private collaboration. And I think COVAX, through the ACT Accelerator, is a very good platform for that. And Moga is laughing, or is smiling. I mean, it's the platform we have, right? And we need to learn, right?
Okay.
So, I mean,
let's hear it, Moga.
Well, okay. Just that we have some data. Moderna themselves, they said that the whole development and manufacturing of the vaccine is totally, utterly funded by the government, all of it. So how much, we don't know. Well, there is some data actually on how much from the NIH and from the what do you call it, BARDA?
Yeah.
I've got this data basically, so it's published. So here is one vaccine that's totally, utterly funded by the government. So that's first off. Yet Moderna is charging high price. The other important thing is, in general, the cost of R&D, whether it's public or private or whatever, the cost of it is still a secret. And there is no way companies will say how much it costs them to produce R&D. The only figure we have is what comes out of Tufts University, their, I think it's called drug study or drug pricing study. There is a group within that university, totally funded by pharma. It's a known thing, totally funded by pharma. And they, every 2 years or every 3 years, they come up with a new figure of, they studied the issue, and that's how it costs. That is the cost of bringing a product to the market. And I think the latest cost was what, 2.5 or something billion to bring a thing on the market. There's lots of issues within that figure. So yes, one of it is the cost of failed projects, clearly, but one of it is the cost of, if you had invested this money elsewhere, you would have got that much profit, and that's considered cost. Yet, during the financial crisis 2008, when the almighty Lehman Brothers totally fell and all investment fell, still the cost of R&D didn't fall. So it's kind of changing it as they like. And of course, the data that enter into the study, totally different to any academic study. You don't have access to the data because it's straight secret. So we're supposed to believe this figure just like that, on confidence or on trust. So this is fundamental problem. That's one issue. If you want to talk about COVAX, yes, COVAX is the only thing we have, but COVAX was set up by people who decided they want to do good things for developing countries. Thank you very much. Developing country governments themselves who will deliver the vaccine are not involved. We argued for, I think, about 4 months to get civil society representation on COVAX. And after so many trouble, they are represented not in all work stream, and it's not real participation. Decisions come made and kind of, here you are, kind of thing. So transparency in COVAX is zero. How decision making is done is zero. The target for COVAX is to vaccinate 20% of the population. I mean, come on. And COVAX is non-supporting, in fact, it's almost rubbishing other mechanisms that can increase supply. COVAX talks about money. Even if you have all the money in the world in COVAX, what are you going to buy? There isn't the vial, there isn't the doses in the market to buy. You know, the almighty Europe doesn't have enough vaccines and people are screaming. So what are you going to buy? And yet COVAX doesn't want to say, yes, we want technology transfer. Yes, even just a political statement, not necessarily going and doing it, just a political statement. They don't say that. If you talk about it, oh, intellectual property is not an issue. We didn't say that intellectual property is the only issue. There's two things to expand production. We're all in a problem with global supply, rich and poor countries. To expand production, you have to enable maximizing the manufacturing capacity by sharing two things, sharing technology and licensing IP. So that's where the what you talked about, Nolan, the waiver in the WTO, licensing IP there by waiving certain intellectual property. It's not all intellectual property, by the way. Certain intellectual property until we have herd immunity, then bring it back. And it's only on technology related to COVID. So it's very specific. It's very limited. It's just to get us out of this mess that we're in. That's all. And this technology that you're talking about, Corey, that is absolutely critical. But which company is going to share technology? Moderna is the only one that said, we're not going to implement IP. When we talked to them about technologies, they said no. They said, first, we don't have people to, to go around and share. And the second thing they said, well, if we share mRNA, if it has a future relevance in other products, we will just give you that technology. No. So let the world die meantime, because we want to maintain monopoly on that particular technology. Given that Pfizer has it and BioNTech have it, and BioNTech is sharing it with some other companies, and CureVac have it, and the Chinese have it, but they still want to do the one because they're the one who produced the market. The others haven't yet.
Okay, we're
So
starting.
what is the logic?
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, we're starting to close in on time here. And so I've got a couple questions in the queue, but folks, please submit any other questions you have. And again, just want to kind of recap here. There's the technology transfer that's necessary, the IP sharing, and there does seem to be a question of, if this is a highly valuable technology, the mRNA platform, who does it belong to? And because you're saying many companies have it, and what is the real impact of this long term on a pharma company if they have it and they decide to share it? Are they giving away the?
And there's also the problem, Corey, of actual manufacturing capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that we can't forget that, because while
It does exist. We just say we don't, I lived through that before on the HIV. Okay, it wasn't supply, it was price, but it was manufacturing was the issue. And it's a lot of things with COVID is a deja vu for me. And it was pharmaceutical companies were saying exactly the same. There is no capacity in developing countries. And when Indians
I'm not
started
talking about developing countries, if I may interrupt. I'm talking about Africa, and South Africa being basically the only geography where you have significant production. And I'm talking about Latin America as well. And I think in general, take the example of last week, the government of India, they didn't want to export vaccines from India because they don't even have enough capacity to really provide to the country, right?
Why? Why? Ask why. Why? Because AstraZeneca has, I'm almost sure, exclusive license with Serum. There's so many companies in India. They chose Serum. Okay, it's the biggest company and all that, fine. But one company is not enough. This is the issue. One company in the north and the south in Mars is not enough. We want, as many companies that can produce, we want them to produce. There is a difference between if your goal is public health, and therefore you go from that, you want herd immunity, you want from that, you want enough doses, and you go from that, how do I get enough doses? That's not what people are thinking about. Sorry.
Here's a question from the audience about one approach to dealing with this. Is there any conversation at the international level about a convention or something to address this problem and address vaccines as a public good? Just given the nature of pandemics and the increasing likelihood and risk of pandemics in the future, it seems like, you know, it could make sense to have that baseline acknowledged now. And that might be maybe the most important feature of preparedness for future pandemics. Is there any conversation about making this a public good?
Yeah. Yes, there is conversation. The UN Secretary General talked about vaccine as a public good, and WHO with a number of states, 40 countries, they started last April, so a year ago, something called the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, which is about pooling the technology, licensing intellectual property, and then sub-licensing and sharing with capable companies. It's based on something that exists for HIV and it's working fine for HIV. But not one single country is in, when I mean governments, like, you know, rich government, the US, the UK, the Germany, all these people, not one single country is supporting it. Not one single company is interested in it. In fact, they rubbish it. You know, the head of Pfizer, the CEO of Pfizer, I think he said it's nonsense.
Yeah, I think
Yes,
I wouldn't like to.
Yes,
Yeah,
so
I personally
so
wouldn't
here
like to be fair.
Here is a system that can work, and we're rubbishing it. COVAX rubbish it. So how do you get it working? So now they're talking the G7, you know, our dear Boris and the others. They talk about, oh, we should have a treaty. Well, I'm worried. Yes, we should have a treaty, but would you have the treaty about sharing technology, about maximizing production for everybody, so everybody, about fair allocation? No.
Anna, did you have a response?
Yeah, I would like to highlight, for me, I think it's important. This is not about the public sector against the private one. I think the problem here is that we are not used to collaborating. We have a problem that can't be solved because private investment won't be efficacious if it is addressed only on a per country basis. We are going to lose a lot of money. So we don't have a collaboration mechanism. And listen, I've seen a lot of high level agreements, treaties, etc. It's not about the agreement, it's about the money. We need a pool of money that is ready there to prioritize on certain conditions for distribution. WHO has a minimal budget. They can't really lead anything without budget in life. You can't lead.
Anna, you have CEPI that is supposed to fund research.
CEPI
and you
is
have
a
Domini,
great, yeah, if
but
I
they're
may
not
talk.
doing anything. They're not
I think
enough.
But is the idea, Anna, that the COVAX with sufficient if COVAX was sufficiently funded, that would be enough to create this incentive?
COVAX is part of the ACT Accelerator, which was a platform. I mean, the Ebola crisis helped us learn that we need organizations to develop innovation for infectious diseases, and that's how CEPI is born. And CEPI is an outstanding development. Now, and indeed, CEPI was the first one doing call for proposals for innovation on COVID. Like in February, they were already doing call for proposals. Now, the budget that CEPI has, and now they are refunding, is very small. They need a bigger budget. We need a bigger budget for CEPI and more empowerment of CEPI. ACT Accelerator was like a new mechanism to kind of for something that CEPI is focused on vaccines. We needed treatments as well, and we needed global supply. So we need to learn. But I think the point here, I don't think is fighting private public. It's more how we can learn to collaborate and be this a win-win, because pharma is not going to win either if this is not done effectively.
Okay, well, so just since we're approaching time, I want to make sure we mention, I think, Moga, some of your allies were involved in filing proxy shareholder proposals on the pricing question and the government support question at J&J and Pfizer. And so for folks involved in proxy voting, that's something to be aware of as we're talking about these issues. And now, just since we're at time, I'm going to give everyone 30 seconds for closing thoughts. If you could focus on what would you ask the companies to do? What would be your top thing? And then we can take that away with us as we go back to our engagement work. Maybe Nolan, I'm going to come to you first. It's unfair because you're part of we're on the same team here doing similar work.
Sure.
What do you think?
I think more transparency around manufacturing technology is needed here. And, clearly the companies that are producing vaccines at scale and transferring very slowly. And they are doing technology transfers, but most of these technology transfers are going to Swiss companies to make parts of their complete vaccine. But not everything can be proprietary. So even if you get really good at something, I think more transparency, where the competitive advantages make sense, perhaps holding it back. But I think encouraging companies to do the technology transfers, short of their USP, would be really, really, really helpful. And maybe this is a complicated thing that can't happen. When you have, these extremely complex processes around the mRNA, everything looks like it's going to be proprietary at the end, down to the shape of the vial. But realistically, your USP is going to be in future development, and your USP won't be worth much if we have continued systemic risk, elevated volatility, and you can't sell your other products because people are locked at home or can't do their surgeries. So that's kind of my takeaway is looking for a way forward on that. And I'm just admitting that it's a very challenging project. I think it takes both investment and also interest from investors, to see a more collaborative pharmascape in the future.
Moga?
Well, I think investors have a great role to play, and we again tested that during the HIV crisis. And I remember working with investors they produced guidelines for companies to basically how they're going to judge company based on how they perform on HIV. It was brilliant. Unfortunately, I can't find it on the internet, but I have a copy. But anyway, so I think you have a great role in making the companies understand that this is a public relation problem. If they don't really share the technology and work for public health, you're going to lose on economic basis, you're going to lose on reputation really badly, and that would affect. And also the third thing is regulation. If people get fed up that that once we see in my country, for example, once we see that people in the north are vaccinated and we're not vaccinated, they will push for compulsory mechanisms, and therefore you just lose your technology. In fact, going for the pool, the WHO pool, is far more coordinated and regulated sharing that maintain quite a bit of your profit and obviously your reputation. So I think investors should really look into producing guidelines for companies and talking to companies.
Wonderful, and I'd love to see that the materials from the AIDS epidemic. Anna?
Yeah, so I would advocate for well-funded platforms to advance R&D innovation and clearly defined rules for access of the innovation that comes out of these platforms, because you are always going to need pharma. But if those rules are set up before, it's going to be, in my perspective, much more effective rather than individual discussions with each one of those organizations for geographies where price can't be the same. It's going to be always like that.
Wonderful. Well, we're 5 minutes past time. I'm sure we could talk for much, much longer about this, and maybe we'll reconvene down the road to pick some of this up. But for now, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone joining. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.